Afternoon, everyone. Apologies that what I'm going to say is very rooted in English experience, but there are principles that I'm going to be talking about that hopefully will relate to other countries that people may come from and other community ethoses that people are familiar with back home. As it says in the book, my background is in housing, a career as a housing professional in different places across England and different sectors, and I'm now an academic in Northampton. But working with a lot of different friends in the mutual sector, increasingly I've been perturbed about what's been happening in England to do with the private rented sector, and talking to people in the mutual sector who are saying, well, we might have to do this, we might have to provide houses for market, or properties for market rent. And I say, no, you don't, and it's about time to actually stand up and say why, and try and delineate that just a little bit. That was just put that in just as the abstract. What I'm going to talk about is just what's happening with the private rental sector in the UK, and what, in particular, I consider to be three key aspects that are going to be so detrimental to the community-led sector trying to take it seriously, and that's to do with finances, it's to do with affordable frameworks and particularly welfare attitudes, and it's to do with community dynamics. And then if there's time, there's a few comments about alternatives. In the last few years, and it's not been something that's just been promoted by one colour of government, it's been something that both the previous Labour administration in England and the current coalition of Tory and Liberal Democrats have been promoting. In the last 6 to 8 years, there's been a whole series of reports that when you put them together, I argue, I'm trying to make an intellectual foundation of why private sector rental should be seen as just a part of the mainstream that we live with forever and a day, a new invigorated private rental sector. And these are some of the topics that people have used to justify what the private rental sector can do, about the planning regulatory change to support that, about how it offers long-term stewardship akin to the sorts of attitudes to properties in areas that people have to use, especially in the middle and upper class of the world. About in what sense conditions can be favourable for buy-to-let landlords with assets that could then buy properties at others to rent, about tapping into finances from the financial and the pension sectors for substantial investment, and about how this sort of delivery can help countries long-term shortfalls for new housing, and about how it can minimise risk for building homes if you don't have to stretch people to take out mortgages that they're struggling to afford with the prices in the UK market at the minute. So a whole series of foundations in reports that have tried to boost the overall claim that the private rental sector has only benefits in the long term. The context of what's been happening is that now the private rental sector in the UK is bigger than the social sector and the council housing sector put together. It's at least 17% of all households, and it's been rising steadily. What's particularly interesting is that in the boom years, and if you look at in the recent English housing market boom years that began to fall away after the financial crash in about 2007, 2008, but if you look at that being in the middle of a 10-year period, in the UK, in that period, there were 1.8 million new dwellings created, either built or refurbished out of other properties that were turned into residential use, or properties that were subdivided, etc. 1.8 were created in that 10-year period, but in the same period, 2.1 properties actually new properties became used for rent. So in all that period in the UK, when there was a boom in construction steadily that people wanted to see constantly rising to meet national needs, rental was outstripping all of that put together. So when we talk about the percentage of the stock, we don't generally talk about just the sheer extent of the number of properties that are becoming now focused on private rental tenancies. And the latest government support is £1 billion worth of money for shared equity between the government and private developers to do joint partnerships to develop new properties for rent, and a £10 million loan guarantee if it's needed, that it could be drawn on to support similar schemes. So substantial cash and substantial guarantees. You can put that in the context of his current support for community-led initiatives, which is £30 million in the UK. £1 billion for cash for this, as against £30 million for community-led initiatives. And increasingly, market rents, as I've come on to, are being used as benchmarks, and market conditions are being used as benchmarks for all other housing tenures as well. When we talk about private rental sector facilities and provisions in the UK, there are some particular things that really we're encompassing in that glib phrase. One of them is open market level rents, the actual cost of tenancy being a complete open market, get what you can attitudes out there. They're increasingly limited short hold tenancies for 6 months and then perhaps less if there's licenses afterwards. There's usually management fees for finding properties, and there's a big concern at the moment about the diverse behaviour of self-employed letting agents. There are invariably investors' conditions about what the investors require from the properties for them to invest into it. And increasingly, people are having to share accommodation. So it's not necessarily private self-contained accommodation, it's increasingly shared accommodation. So those are typical benchmarks in the current private sector. The argument here that I'm talking about is why the neutral community-led sector shouldn't bother with private sector rents. I mean, you could say, well, if it was considering providing properties for private sector, at private sector equivalent levels, it could do something about limiting these sorts of problems. It doesn't need to let at short sentences. It doesn't need to involve fees. It might be able to consider investments or investment partners that don't set onerous conditions. And it doesn't need to necessarily focus on shared accommodation. And that's true to an extent. If you're talking about private sector rents, I would argue that the one thing that's consistent, however you approach it, is you were talking about open market costs. And so that's the particular focus that I'm going to say is behind the rest of the points I'm making now. If there was an argument that the community-led sector can minimise some of these shortfalls. And I've tried to imagine, in a sense, what would be the initiating reasons for community-led groups, community-led housing initiatives, communal initiatives, to want to consider taking out private sector rental properties. And I think these are the main ones that I think would be pertinent to their consideration of that. They could be leasing properties from a private landlord. My guess is if that was the case, a lot of those previous benchmarks would apply. So there would be full drawbacks to that. It might be that a group is thinking of commissioning new provision on an external site, and it needs higher rents, at least as a benchmark, to make what it perceives to be the economics of the development stack up. It might be that they're considering commission on their own sites, like a site like Findhorn, in terms of new provision here, but needing to consider whether or not to charge open market rent levels on new provision on an existing site. And it might be that they want to change existing community units to private rental conditions. As I said, the theme that would run through all of those would certainly be, at the very least, charging open market rents if we're talking about properties equivalent to private sector conditions. And I said I'm going to focus on 3 particular concerns. One is about finances, one is about affordability attitudes, and one is about community dynamics. I think communities, groups, community-led initiatives should really be wary about the impact of thinking of private renters in terms of the finances, because increasingly what's happening in the UK is that rent levels are even higher than mortgage costs. And if people had access to being able to take out mortgages, they would be paying less than they would be paying private rent levels. And the extent to which rent levels are rising at the minute, there was a report in today's Guardian that said in London, which is a hyperinflated market, but nevertheless often indicative of what happens elsewhere, in London, 9 out of 10 claimants for welfare support to top up their ability to pay private rents are actually in employment. 9 out of 10 of those claimants are in employment and still need welfare benefits to meet the ever-increasing private rent levels. I think, again, the investment community looks at private rental investments as a way of loading up what their returns can be in the medium to long term. And I would argue that communities should be really, really wary about accepting loans and accepting debts that are going to be solely servicing non-community interests. Increasingly, what's happening with household incomes being used to service private rent levels is they have reduced capacity to actually engage with less and less of what's happening in the community at large in the local economy, and less capacity to even service the sorts of repairs needed to keep their properties intact. And I would argue that if communities are thinking of taking some properties at a higher rent and providing some properties in the future at higher rent as a distinct difference from other properties and other tenancies or other letting conditions they've already got, it will remain increasingly hard to justify variations between that into the future. But there's a particular concern about what's happening with what I mentioned as the private rental sector being used as benchmarks across housing tenures in the UK, because it will have, and is already having, an impact upon the way that housing affordability has been used to help support households who can't necessarily operate in the open market, who can't accept paying open market costs for rental, for ownership, and have access for quite some years now affordable housing of one kind or the other. There's quite an acceptable framework for that in the UK, and a lot of community groups actually access support from their local authorities and from new members through the frameworks for affordable housing that have been set up over the years. What will happen, I believe, is what's already begun to happen with the way the private rental sector costs and properties are being accepted as suitable to meet homelessness and not affordable housing being considered as essential to meet homelessness. So you're having more properties at open market costs being used to provide emergency accommodation for homeless households because the governments have changed the rules in the last few years to allow that to happen. What is the position in UK planning frameworks is that affordable housing can be provided where households' needs can't be met on the open market. But if more and more properties are being used from the open market to actually house those households, it will weaken any future justification for having a separate affordable housing structure. And that's what Labour governments started to make inroads to weaken before they lost office, and it's what the coalition government is doing now. So they are extending the opportunities for private stock to be used for emergency and affordable needs at open market costs, which will water down future abilities to maintain an affordable supply. For those who are familiar with UK, the social housing sector and the housing association world, there is a whole change in the way that affordable rents and affordable rental development costs have been now attached to levels of open market rents as a a benchmark for the sorts of rental streams that landlords are expected to bring in to fund new property. And so the phrase at the moment for affordable rents is that they should be at up to 80% of open market costs. But that's quite a difference from what it was a couple of years ago, where it was either a fixed ceiling of an amount for that property in that type, or sometimes a percentage of a household income. Now it's completely tied to open market values, although the acceptance is it shouldn't be above 80%. But all of 80%, 80. But all of the rhetoric is about things being intimately attached to open market costs. So I said that once. I suppose the particular concern I would want to say to community groups is the impact of private rental supply upon community dynamics. If they think that it's appropriate to embark on new private property at private sector cost levels, as for some people who are not being part of the community to date, in a sense thinking about having to adopt private market costs for new people to come and join the community at a higher cost to that household. And my understanding about intentional groups is always that, in a sense, it's very much about equal measures, benefits for all and equal measures for what the community stands for. And if communities are seriously thinking that, well, they need some property or they need some income, and they could get that through having to accept open market costs, I would argue that there's an extreme line being crossed there that will seriously be detrimental to their ethos of community equality. I think also you can argue that if that works within that community and that provision, that communal provision, to introduce higher and higher costs around, that community will be increasingly less attractive to new members. Because one of the conditions clearly in England that people who want to come and live in community life is to secure cost effectiveness of that. It's not as expensive as open market costs, and there's much more that people get. But introducing market rents and the pressure of paying that level of costs to people will, I could see, detract from people wanting to join communities and thinking of joining communities in the first place. I know some communities have issues to do with individuals renting out properties on an ad hoc, personal basis. I think all communities are going to have to deal with that in their own way, but my suggestion would be as a way of trying to minimise how increasing tensions might arise from some people renting out properties for ever increasing rents if they are drawn towards being as much a landlord as they could possibly be. It would be for the communities themselves to actually license in-house renters, actually to do it as a community initiative rather than as a private individual initiative. Actually to say, we have a rule here in this community of how properties could be let on a basis, but it has to be driven by the community with a shared operating ethos. It's not just down to an individual household to get individual renters in on an ad hoc basis. But that would be my suggestion. What would be some alternatives that communities could consider to private rent? Well, there are frameworks that still exist about providing rental stock for affordable or sub-market rates. It's not the case that the only way of doing it is at market rates, at market costs. There are supporters and there are investors and there are financial frameworks for doing it at sub-market rates. There are limited ownership options if community groups aren't completely averse to some degree of equity ownership or property ownership. And there are other equity share models. And there's a brilliant new initiative that's almost finished on site. Certainly some people are living in this community in Leeds called Lilac, which is on a mutual ownership basis. It's a cooperative co-housing. It's a combination of cooperative co-housing principles. And people are paying for their properties on a communal basis in relation to the size of their property minority in proportion of their income, and they will build up a share equity that they could have as a personal stake if they ever needed to leave for some reason. But there are frameworks for working out what that would be and how much they could take away. It's brand new, but they've done a really creditable job in putting it together. I said about managing rental on an ad hoc basis. And I think communities are in a good position to try and invite other sorts of what we call crowdfunding in England, other sorts of local sympathetic investments to support community development as a whole, and not just for that to be anonymous private sector renting land. What I think the neutral sector particularly can do to challenge it is to point out how clearly a private rental sector provision at the moment it continues to unbalance the UK market because it doesn't decrease speculative bad habits one bit, and it looks like it's actually increasing them when the speculative habits have been at the heart of a lot of the financial crashes. And as I'm sure everybody knows, the mutual sector has an enviable history in consistent financial strength and stability in returns across the years and across different countries. The market rents are divisive and monopolistic and increasingly constraining on households taking part in their local economy and their local society. Including the neutral sector provisions can justify how their approach is a million times better than that. And it can be all sorts of things. It can be through the co-ops, it can be through co-housing, it can be through community land trusts, and other variants within other countries. So the question at the front of the talk was, does the community-led sector need to accept providing housing for rent? I'm trying to say no, it doesn't. And are there implications if it tries to consider that? I think it's about using it. Are there implications that will be worrying for communities? And I think yes. But are there alternatives to that? And I say yes. If one of the rationales that communities are thinking about developing private sector rent is simply to generate cash, simply to generate some money, some extra money that could be used by the community, I think there are other ways of doing that. And doing it through increasing the level of residency costs for a certain number of households, I think would be, I suggest, quite insecure for the community as a whole. And there would be other ways of doing it. So, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So we've got a few minutes for any questions or comments, if there are some from the floor. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it seems to me so much of this is led by the fact that there aren't enough houses. There is not enough housing for everybody who needs it. And we have this in microcosm in the community where I live. You know, there are not enough houses. And I mean, that in England it seemed to me, you know, the selling off of the council houses and then more houses were not built to keep up the necessary level of housing. And of course this particular government is very keen on a market, you know, a sort of market-led provision for everything. I mean, you didn't say anything about that, but to me that seems to underlie a lot of what you said about market rents and so on, because I think they would be lower if there was sufficient housing. I mean, what do you think of that? I mean, do you think that's true or not? Or am I just being incredibly simplistic?
Martin, before you answer, can I just say I think it would be very helpful if you could tell us who you are and where you're from.
Yes, okay. Well, I'm Priya from Oroville.
Okay, thank you very much.
Not familiar with Oroville. Oroville is?
In India.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. we could spend weeks and weeks talking about the state of the UK market, and I suppose the one connection I'd make with what I'm saying to do with what you're saying about the wider problems in the UK market is, I think part of the problem with things not happening in a greater extent in England, house building not happening to a greater extent, is the cost. And while people see more and more financial return coming into those who can provide, whether by building or by providing for rent, I think it has a brake upon others doing things because the scarcity value pushes up prices. So the actual prices themselves become part of that brake on future development, because the ones who can afford to provide are in a position of maximising their returns at that moment in time. I think providing substantial new amounts of housing can break that sort of stranglehold only if you've got strong regulatory control. I don't consider the open market will do that. You really need something like price controls to provide new properties, but at price-controlled levels. You know, you could do that so that you could sell it. There would be a ceiling at what you could sell, or it's a ceiling at which you could trade. So it's not just, you know, a one-off saving that's recouped by the first incoming household. You know, I think you can be more subtle and imaginative about that. But at the minute, the UK market is so, I consider, to be so fascinated by opportunities for speculative, monopolistic gain, that the very costs are becoming part of the problem of stopping new things happening. You know, it's part of that, and it's, the picture is to do with who's got resources and why they're not happening to bring other things forward. You know, we're either talking about the house builders and then monopolistic control about resources like land and building contracts, or else we're talking about people who can afford to go out and be buy-to-let landlords and then monopolise on things. You know, so I didn't really want to say too much about the wider picture, the wider housing scene, to be honest, because clearly private rental sector provision is still going to carry on. But I would want to argue that it's a damaging benchmark for other people to think they have to accept, or that should be applied to more and more housing settings.
Okay, I think we've probably just about got time for two more questions. So there's a lady here and then another one.
So my name is Betsy Morris. I live at Berkeley Co-Housing, and I've been active as a research director for a position I invented for COHO US, Co-Housing Association of US. But we now have a co-housing researchers network, and there's a conversation following this in which we can follow up some of the, how do we find out more about what's going on in the sector. But I've written and researched on affordability strategies in the US, so I very much appreciate your flagging, I guess, this issue of rents in the UK, which is new to me. But I wanted to offer two things, and maybe get your thoughts. One is the Positive Money Institute here in the UK really opened up my mind with a very small and simplistic video about why does housing cost so much. And it very explicitly rejects the idea that there's a lack of housing. There's many housing being built, but it's being built for speculative or second homes. So it's not being built to be affordable. And the second element that I'm quite interested in now is where do we begin to take our property, our communities off of the debt cycle. And it's very hard to imagine how we'll get out of the debt cycle, because the interest on debt is part of what is making prices go up and up and up, as many people are bidding, but incomes are not going up. So this is kind of my backgrounding, my attempt to connect some dots. So it's bigger than what communities themselves can do. But I do know that a question that we have in the US is people who are coming into cooperative living or co-housing circles. I have a network of 2,000 seekers and some of them come in because they think community is cheaper, which it can be over the long run, as you point out. Once you buy in at a level, you can keep it from going up. But I did wonder if that's that issue of there are people who need lower cost housing and there's community and they are not exactly matched. But where are some of the alliances that we could make in the US there's a big nonprofit housing sector, and we're trying to have conversations as co-housing, have conversations about that, how to bring our community mutual strengths into that much larger sector, but they're struggling for money as well. So I just wonder how, if you see any connections between the public provision or the more charitable provision of housing and communities.
I mean, it mirrors a discussion that people are having in the UK about mixed tenure development and community-led mixed tenure discussions. And I do wonder what opportunities there might be for the slightly better resourced, if you like, co-housing end of the mutual sector in the US to be able to pair up with the land trust movement and
We already have.
on one site,
Yes.
to do more than one property on one site.
I'd be glad to follow up on that. It's a really,
You know.
a really important conversation, and it's not as clear
Yeah.
that mutual benefit. There's a certain cultural integration that really is better for both parties to work on or be conscious of, including investing in the culture creation by having trainings and community organizing before people move in. So I'll leave it at that.
I certainly agree with part of what you said to begin with about the numbers of properties that also exist in a place like the UK, because there are still hundreds of thousands of properties that are empty and are not being used, and there are some millions of second homes that are increasingly detrimental to local people who are priced out of local markets. Schools collapse because local people can't live there with their children, shops collapse because they're not there all the time, etc., etc. And so it's absolutely ridiculous that for the sake of an house owning mentality, we allow all sorts of local societies to fall by the wayside for people to have a holiday two weeks a year or a holiday. Absolutely crazy. Again, I don't think that will change in the UK until you have a strong enough government.
Yes.
We'll ride across that with clear regulation. Find ways so that people aren't out of pocket if they, if they've got a loan on that holiday home, but find ways of actually challenging it. I don't think the costs of housing development in the long term will be manageable for us as a series of societies without regulatory activity. And I mean that also regulation about banks and lending agencies and stuff.
So it's like this is a conversation that needs to continue, but we'll have to close it there. Just a small point on that.
Yeah.
The community here, the forms of tenure for private ownership, insist that if you own a house on site, somebody has to live it. Well, not for you, you can't leave it empty. Lady at the back.
Hi, I'm Jo Gooding, I'm from the Co-Housing Network. Hi Martin. I guess we're not going to get land reform. We didn't have a revolution back in the 19th century. It's not property ownership reform. Just a couple of things. I don't think many community organisations do charge market rent. I think they take a kind of a pragmatic view on what's viable and try to charge the minimum once costs are met, non-profit. There aren't very many at all. You could count them on one hand that do that. And I guess the alternatives, mutual home ownership society being one alternative, but we know that was heavily subsidised by a programme that we're never going to see the likes of again. Part of that subsidy was for the build method, but also it's not replicable. So we have to break that down and look what would it take to make it replicable. The thing about the argument a bit, so we're taking out some of the terminology and not maybe using it how we sometimes do, when we talk about market rent, is what concerns me is the community sector is not part of that dialogue, because we're looking at very monolithic, large, nasty structures that most private rental sector organisations, pension funds are looking to put up, and that will be our solution for families, for single people, and it concerns me that the community sector doesn't take part in that, because they could deliver something infinitely more sustainable, more enjoyable for people to live in. And I wonder what you thought to that, Martin.
I suppose I'd still suggest that I'm wanting for members of the community-led sector in the UK to be part of that type of debate. It's not to say we can do market rents like provision better, but we've got something else that we don't need to embark on more of that, because we can give you a range of products that are more sustainable, inexpensive, etc., etc. But I'd agree that there is scope clearly for people to put those proposals forward at a more noticeable stage. On a more noticeable stage. It doesn't get heard enough.
And community organisations need to feel at a local level that they're part of that debate, that they don't have to accept what is going to be proposed by large corporate structures. They will unlock a much better solution.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Martin Field for your contribution. I think.